There are people who spend half their lives thinking something is wrong with the way they are built. They think they are too sensitive, too alert, too intense, too difficult to relax around other people, too quick to notice what no one else seems to notice, too slow to trust, too aware of shifts in tone, energy, posture, silence. And because the world rarely has generous language for these patterns, they often end up naming them as flaws. Overthinking, hypervigilance, trust issues, emotional exhaustion, being too much. But there is another possibility, and it is less comfortable than self criticism because it asks you to look at your life differently. Maybe you are not too much. Maybe your nervous system was simply shaped inside conditions that did not allow you to remain unguarded for very long. Maybe what you call a personality problem is, in part, a survival intelligence. Not the glamorous kind, not the kind people celebrate in classrooms or offices or online biographies, a quieter kind, a more private kind, the kind that develops when safety is inconsistent, when emotional weather changes without warning, when being able to read a room is not socially impressive but psychologically necessary. Some people learn human nature out of curiosity. Others learn it because not understanding people fast enough once came with consequences. And that difference matters. Because when a child grows up in an unpredictable environment, the mind does not simply collect memories. It organizes itself around anticipation, around scanning, around prediction, around subtle cues. Developmental psychology has long shown that early adversity can heighten sensitivity to threat, especially social threat. The amygdala becomes more reactive. Attention becomes biased toward what might go wrong. The body learns that small signals matter. So later in life, you may walk into a room and sense tension before anyone has spoken. You may notice the half-second pause in someone's voice, the smile that arrives a little too late, the energy shift no one else mentions. You may call it intuition. Other people may call it sensitivity. But often it is pattern recognition trained under pressure. You are not imagining more than everyone else. In many cases, you are perceiving more than everyone else. Because some part of you learned early that perception was protection. That is the first thing people misunderstand about this kind of mind. It does not become perceptive because it wanted to be profound. It becomes perceptive because missing the signal once cost too much. And the same is true of empathy. There are people who seem to feel other people almost before those people feel themselves. They notice strain behind politeness. They hear sadness beneath composure. They can sense when someone is not fine even if the performance is convincing enough for everyone else. From the outside, that can look like emotional giftedness. And sometimes it is. But sometimes it began somewhere harsher than that. Sometimes empathy is not born only from warmth. Sometimes it is born from vigilance. If you grew up around moods you had to track, reactions you had to predict, atmospheres you had to manage, then feeling other people deeply was not a spiritual achievement. It was adaptation. The mind became fluent in emotional weather because it had to. That is why some of the most compassionate people you will ever meet are also the most tired. Because what looks like tenderness from the outside may have started as monitoring from the inside. And this is where the subject becomes difficult. Because once you begin to see the intelligence hidden inside survival, there's a temptation to turn all of it into something noble, to romanticize the whole structure, to say, maybe my pain made me special. But that would also be a distortion. Carl Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That applies here more than people realize. Because a survival pattern can become so familiar that it starts to feel like identity, you stop saying, I learned to do this, and start saying, this is just who I am. I am just independent. I am just hard to fool. I am just someone who needs a lot of space. I am just someone who thinks deeply. Maybe, but maybe some of what you call your nature is actually your history still moving through you. That is why self-reliance, for example, is not always as simple as strength. Some people become extraordinarily competent because relying on others once felt unsafe. They become the calmest person in the crisis, the one who figures it out, the one who does not wait to be rescued, the one who solves, carries, adapts, endures. And yes, there is real strength in that, but there is also often an invisible sentence beneath it. I learned very early that dependence was risky, so competence became safety. This is why a person can look strong and still be organized around fear. Why someone can appear mature while carrying a nervous system that never fully trusted support. Albert Bandura wrote about self-efficacy as the belief in one's capacity to act. But there are forms of self-reliance that are not built from healthy confidence. They are built from repeated disappointment. They do not say, "I know I can." They say, "I do not believe anyone else will." That distinction changes everything. The same paradox appears in pressure. Have you ever noticed how some people are most impressive when things go wrong? They become sharper in emergencies, more focused, more decisive, more strategic. They can hold chaos with eerie calm. While other people panic, they get clearer. At first, this looks like resilience. And some of it is, but some of it is also familiarity. The body is not always calm in crisis because it is powerful. Sometimes it is calm because crisis feels like home terrain. The system knows this frequency. It recognizes urgency. It has practiced this state for years, which is why such people can be brilliant when the world is burning and deeply unsettled when nothing is wrong. Stillness becomes harder than pressure. Rest becomes stranger than responsibility. Silence feels less safe than noise, and that confuses people. They ask, "If I'm so exhausted, why can't I relax?" Because relaxation is not only a physical act, it is also a psychological permission, and many people never received that permission early enough for it to feel natural later. William James once wrote that the greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. But before choice comes recognition. Before regulation comes truth. You cannot soften a system you still misread. You cannot rest inside yourself if you still think your alertness is simply a strange personality defect. You have to understand what it was for. And perhaps nowhere is this more painful than in trust. People with this kind of history are often not incapable of trust. They are precise with it, slow with it. They do not move toward closeness because closeness, in their experience, may once have contained confusion, or inconsistency, or emotional cost. So their filters get stronger. They notice contradiction quickly. They hear what does not match. They feel when something is off. And this can protect them from false intimacy. It can make them hard to manipulate, hard to deceive, hard to win over with appearances alone. But it can also isolate them. Because the same filter that protects against danger can block tenderness too. And if no one has ever explained this to you carefully, you may spend years feeling split between two interpretations of yourself. One part of you senses there is depth in the way you move through the world. Another part worries you are just damaged in prettier language. That inner conflict is one of the deepest pains in people like this. Not, am I intelligent? But, am I seeing something real in myself? Or am I just trying to make suffering sound meaningful? That is why this conversation matters. Because the answer is neither simple self-celebration nor simple self-diagnosis. It is more honest than both. There are forms of perception, emotional acuity, strategic thinking, and existential seriousness that are genuinely sharpened by hardship. Research on post-traumatic growth, especially the work of Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, suggests that some people do emerge from adversity with a deeper sense of meaning, altered priorities, and increased appreciation for life's essentials. But post-traumatic growth is not the same as saying trauma is good. Sharpness is real. So is cost. Wisdom is real. So is exhaustion. Sensitivity is real. So is grief. The insight, then, is not that pain secretly made you superior. It is that pain may have organized your mind into forms that are both adaptive and heavy, useful and expensive, brilliant and burdensome. And this is the central reframe. There are parts of you that were never born to make you special. They were born to make you safe. The tragedy is that after enough years, you may start calling those parts your personality. You may think your hyper-awareness is simply who you are. Your emotional intensity is simply who you are. Your distrust is simply who you are. Your self-reliance is simply who you are. Your inability to rest is simply who you are. Maybe some of it is, but maybe some of it is architecture built in emergency that was never meant to become your permanent home. Viktor Frankl wrote that what man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal. But there is another truth that belongs beside it. Some people have lived with too much internal tension for too long, and what they need first is not more striving. It is the experience of not having to earn safety every minute. Healing in this context is not becoming less perceptive. It is not becoming shallow. It is not losing your depth, your seriousness, your ability to read people, your sensitivity to contradiction, your sense for what is real. It is something more subtle than that. It is learning that these capacities no longer have to remain on duty all the time. It is allowing perception to become perception again, instead of constant surveillance. It is allowing sensitivity to become sensitivity again, instead of preparedness. It is allowing rest to stop feeling like negligence. And that may be one of the hardest transitions a human being can make. Because when a mind has been shaped by survival, peace does not immediately feel like home. Sometimes it feels like exposure. Sometimes it feels undeserved. Sometimes it feels suspiciously quiet. But that does not mean peace is wrong for you. It may simply mean your system has not yet learned that safety and stillness can exist in the same room. So if you see yourself in this, be careful with the story you tell. Do not reduce yourself to damage. But do not romanticize every scar into destiny either. Tell the truer story, that you adapted, that some of those adaptations became extraordinary forms of awareness, that some of them also became heavy, that your depth may be real, but not all of it arrived gently, and that perhaps the most important question is no longer how this mind was formed. The more difficult question is what happens when a person who learned to live by reading everything begins slowly to discover that not every room must be scanned, not every silence must be interpreted, not every bond must be approached like a risk assessment. Because maybe the next chapter is not about becoming sharper. Maybe it is about what remains of you when sharpness is no longer the price of safety. And maybe that is where the real work begins. Not in understanding how you survived, but in learning how a person like you is supposed to feel alive, and not just protected.